Hey everybody, welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening, aviation enthusiasts, and welcome to this episode of CAF Warbird Tube. Tonight, episode number 166, we're going to talk with author Bruce Gamble, who's done some deep research on the Black Sheep Squadron. And tonight, we're not going to focus so much on maybe the history of the unit, but Bruce has got some great stories that I can't wait to hear, and we'll get to those in just a moment. Now, whether you're joining us for the first time, and if you are, welcome, or you're a loyal Warbird Tube fan, we're thrilled to have you with us again tonight. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to share that across your favorite social media platforms. And Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. To find out more about the CAF, our events, aircraft, local units, or how you can be a part of the fun, just visit our website, commemorativeairforce.org. Now, as you're watching tonight and you think of a question, something you'd like clarification on, Bruce is the guy who can answer it about the Black Sheep Squadron. Just type whatever questions you have in the chat box. We'll get them and either answer them during the presentation or we'll save some time at the end to make sure we get all the questions answered before we sign off. All right, now joining me from his home in Georgia, between Atlanta and Augusta, in the heart of the heat, although you mentioned that the heat's kind of gone down a little bit in the last couple of days. Bruce Gamble. Bruce, thank you so very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Good. Well, let's go ahead and start with a little background on you. Now, you're an author. You've published 7 books over the years, but you are also a naval aviator, and you have a lineage that goes back to World War II with family as well. Some fascinating parallels that have kind of woven through your career.
Right. I was a naval flight officer, trained as a navigator. My fleet aircraft was the electronic version of the A3 Sky Warrior, where we did passive electronic reconnaissance for the fleet. A couple of cruises aboard a famous carrier, the USS Carl Vinson. So it was a very exciting time. You made reference to my heritage. My father was a B-29 pilot late in the war, flying B-29s off of the same island where I was stationed. He was stationed at the north end of Guam, and I was at a naval air station in the central part of Guam. And at the beginning of the war, my uncle, who was married to my dad's sister, was a navigator in the first B-17 unit that went over to Australia after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So both of them served in the Pacific, and then 40 years later, that's where I served. And yeah, the continuity and the serendipity of that was not lost on me.
Yeah. And is it the genesis of your, I guess, your bug to dig into history?
That came a lot earlier. I've always been a fan of history, always loved museums and traveling around and exploring sites, or in my case as a kid, it might be battlefields or places like that, old forts on family vacations. Not that I really followed that in my college career, but after my Navy career came to an unexpected end, I was sort of trying to find my way again and slipped into a part-time job at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola and sort of stumbled into a position as a part-time historian for the Museum Foundation and started collecting oral histories. And then the bug really got lit at that point. Or the bug caught me at that point, and I really became a lot more interested in mostly in the Pacific War, which was really the strength of naval aviation's combat history, was between the Pacific War and somewhat in the Korean War, the Vietnam War. All of that was fascinating, but with relatives in World War II, that was where my passion lay. And that's why I followed that for as far as it would take me.
And it's brought you here tonight.
Brought me here tonight, that's right, yeah. And because there's a neat thread that goes through all this to the Black Sheep Squadron, it might be worth pointing out that that position at the museum in Pensacola gave me an opportunity to interview one of the Black Sheep, a guy named John Bolt, who was a really unique individual in that he is the only two-war ace in naval aviation history. He shot down 6 Japanese Zeros in World War II and then shot down 6 MiGs while flying an exchange tour with the Air Force in Korea. And only one guy wearing wings of gold has that distinction. And I had a chance to interview him, and he informed me that the squadron was getting together for a reunion in the spring of '93. It would be their 50th anniversary gathering. And I asked him straight up if he thought that the other pilots would mind if I tagged along at my own expense as a representative of the museum, and he made it happen. So that was the real opening door for me to get involved in the history of VMF 214.
Well, you've got a treasure trove of photos, and also I want to point out that not only the photos, which we're looking at tonight, but you also have a YouTube channel, Sky Warrior Media, and you've done 4 episodes talking about the Black Sheep, and also been able to uncover some great historical footage that you can put with that as well. That's right.
Yeah. I have found that the social media outlets really do open up a tremendous audience. And as a dedicated researcher, I mean, that's been my passion all along, is to really get things factually correct and not embellish anything. Let the facts tell the story. And I'm also a lot more interested in the human interest angle than let's say, for example, the hardware. I've always been more interested in the men than in the machines. But that's just me. But to that end, I have found that chasing down great historic archival footage has really been a pleasure. And finding that and then learning how to edit the software and make it compelling, make it interesting has really been rewarding. So I have 7 episodes planned at this point just on VMF 214. 4 of them are done, and the 5th one's in production. And after that, I have a few other good stories that I plan to do videos on for the channel.
All right. Well, let's dive into some of those stories about the men of VMF 214.
You bet.
Of course, we've got to start with the guy in the middle, right?
The guy in the middle, sure. Everybody knows him as Pappy Boyington. A really good sidebar on this gentleman is the fact that they didn't call him Pappy. He had a couple of nicknames. One was Gramps, because he was 8 or 9 or 10 years older than most of the pilots. He was divorced and had 3 kids. He was 30, turning 31 out there in the Solomon Islands. And so they kind of nicknamed him Grandpa, Grandpappy, you know, that kind of a thing, Gramps. But he was a very casual individual, so mostly they called him Greg. Periodically, if they were just kind of joshing around, they would call him Gramps. The nickname Pappy evolved from a song that they adapted from the Yale Whippin' song that people hear at the beginning of the well-known NBC TV series, and with the "We Are Poor Little Lambs" song. In the lyrics for that, one of the pilots for the cadence used the nickname Pappy just because it fit the cadence of that particular stanza. And And that's where that came from, and correspondents picked up on that.
Okay.
And they started to put it in print. And so right at the end of the war, there are some headlines referring to Pappy Boyington, and that stuck so much that later on in the 1950s, he had his name legally changed to Greg Pappy Boyington.
Wow.
And he's here in that photograph showed him in standing with a few of his first tour pilots. The guy on the left is a Cajun from New Orleans named the last name of Bourgeois, of all things, Bourgeois. And on the right is Bill Case. He's the one gesturing with his hands, who turned out to be one of the squadron's first aces. Great shot of classic F4U-1, the bird, what everybody nicknamed the birdcage Corsairs. This looks like it's either at Turtle Bay or perhaps even at Vella La Vella, based on just the wide open area and the mountain range in the back. And they had great success with this airplane, which was a whole other story, of course. Again, I'm not so much of an authority on the aircraft as on the men, but they had great success, as did other Marine squadrons, using the Corsair as a land-based weapon.
And of course, these airplanes don't look anything like what we see on an air show or at air shows these days.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, they were parked out in the elements and extremely harsh elements. Very high heat, a lot of humidity, a lot of salt air from the proximity of the ocean all around these little islands. A lot of coral dust, a lot of all kinds of junk would accumulate on the inside. And one of the funnier things that I heard from pilots is that when they would roll these things inverted, just all kinds of trash would come floating down from the belly of the plane and shower all over them, from dirt and clods of coral, and all kinds of detritus would come falling onto them from being, what was below them was now above them, falling down. So they were not pretty, put it that way. Great squadron, a great photograph of the squadron gathering here. And this is from, as was that earlier photo with the 5 or 6 of them, this was all part of a staged publicity shoot that was done in mid-September of 1943, right after Greg Boyington took command of this unit. VMF 214 had already served 2 combat tours and had fallen on some pretty hard times during the second combat tour. Morale was bad, and at that particular time, several Corsair squadrons had wrapped up their obligatory combat tours and were scheduled to return to the U.S. And Admiral Halsey, who was running this island hopping campaign up through the Solomons, really needed more Corsair squadrons. And so this back channel authorization was given to Greg Boyington to hand pick 28 pilots and form an ad hoc squadron from guys who were in the replacement pool. And they were there because some of them were replacements right from the States, but others, like Boyington himself, had gotten out of sync with their original unit due to injury or illness or other factors, and were waiting around to see who might pick them up for reassignment. And there was quite a large pool of these available pilots, and so Boyington was able to go around and hand pick 28 good pilots. You can see him with his back to the camera there. And one of the other individuals kneeling down there was a major from Vermont named Stan Bailey. Those two majors did all the selecting of the pilots, and they actually had a very highly qualified group. Even though they were replacements, they had 9 combat veterans, several of whom had more actual victories than Greg Boyington did at the time. And all of them gelled together very well and formed an effective fighting squadron. Boyington's leadership made all the difference because of his previous experience with the Flying Tigers in Burma and China. He had learned some good lessons over there.
So the myth that the Black Sheep were misfits or rejects or whatever term you want to use really is almost contrary to what actually happened, and that was that they went out looking for handpicking the pilots that they wanted.
Yeah, and the point that is behind all this is the fact that Hollywood messed up the history of that squadron for forever.
Yeah,
not messed it up. It was a Hollywood, for viewers who aren't quite aware, NBC did a action adventure series that spanned 3 seasons, initially called Baba Black Sheep, which was the name of Boyington's autobiography, and later they changed it to Black Sheep Squadron. And in most ways, it was about as far from reality as you can imagine. There were a lot of things about it that were just kind of farcical. So they weren't misfits, they weren't outcasts. They were not attached to a combat squadron for a variety of reasons. And so they were available over there in the islands to form this back channel squadron. But other than that, that was kind of the only reason that they weren't assigned anywhere. But the name Black Sheep fit them very well just because they weren't part of regular outfits. And also because of Boyington's own reputation. He'd had a pretty colorful and clouded history with the Marine Corps even before he joined the Flying Tigers. And so the Black Sheep moniker fit him individually and the squadron as a group. And here's another photo from that same publicity shoot where they staged a picture of the pilots scrambling from the parachute loft out toward their airplanes. And in the 3rd episode of the series that I have on YouTube, I found the corresponding video that shows these guys from the front as they come streaming out of that tent, which is the parachute loft. And then a still photographer took this photograph from the side as they came out the door. Well, funny thing is that you can actually see that photographer poke his head around the corner of the tent and then duck back out of sight like somebody was waving, get out of the frame. And you can see he's embarrassed and he sticks his head back around the corner. But then later he apparently popped out and took this picture. So it was really neat to find this little piece of archival footage that fit right together with this little narrative here.
Yeah,
it's all part of a big publicity shoot to just for the home front.
Yeah,
all of this was done to make the people at home feel a little bit better because things weren't going very well at that point.
What do you know? Which was it for? One of the magazines that they did this, or was it the Marine Corps? It was the Marine Corps' PR machine. The movie Full Metal Jacket has some great scenes about how the PR machine worked over in Vietnam, and it was no different in the Solomon Islands during World War II. They had an experienced correspondent who was the public affairs officer for the 1st Marine Air Wing, and he was a published author. And he knew how to put together good media stuff for the people back home. It was all about morale and
and spreading some good news to try to make up for all the bad news.
So the Black Sheep Squadron, I mean, that they were known as that during the war, not to be confused with the TV show that came later. But in the years between World War II, 1943, and the TV show, did Hollywood still have that portrayal of them being misfits, or did that come exactly from the TV show? I'm just trying to check my own history here.
No,
because I remember watching the show.
Yeah, sure. It was really a popular show, and people still follow it pretty religiously. There's a Facebook group dedicated to that TV show that has thousands of followers. And it was a big deal. A lot of the misinformation came from Hollywood, from the executive producer, Stephen Cannell, but the real impetus for the show was Boyington's autobiography, Baba Black Sheep, which was not published until 1958. So to answer your question, after the war, the Black Sheep really kind of were obscure. And people knew who Greg Boyington was. He got in and out of trouble a lot, so he made a lot more headlines just because of his behavior than anything else. And then he got his act together, and in 1958, his autobiography was a bestseller, a genuine bestseller. And there was all kinds of talk about a movie with Robert Mitchum, who was going to play the lead role. But like a lot of Hollywood properties, it just fell apart, and the movie was never made. But a guy named Price, I'm trying to remember his first name, Robert, I do want to think, who was the CEO, if you will, of Universal Television. He had a copy of Boyington's book on his shelf and had read it. And then in the mid-70s, he read it again and really liked it and thought it would make a good series. And so he called in Cannell to write up a pilot program, and then they drafted out the first several episodes, and it took off, figuratively and literally, became a popular series. So the misinformation about them being misfits and outcasts was all just to kind of, it was really a formula series. It was like a Western or anything else. They had the Japanese were the bad guys, and they had lots of barroom fist fights and, a lot of kind of silly episodes and escapades that they got into. And that was sort of where things went sideways at least for the original pilots. They did not like being portrayed as misfits and outcasts, and even talked about, pretty serious talk about suing NBC.
Oh.
It didn't get off the ground, but there was some pretty serious talk about it, just because they considered it pretty slanderous.
Yeah, but Boyington, if I remember, was also involved somewhat in the TV production, correct?
Oh, he was.
Yeah.
Yeah. I did interview Stephen Cannell for my biography of Boyington, and he mentioned a couple of things. One was that Boyington, who never unfortunately had a very good touch for finances, allowed himself to get a soft contract and just was never compensated like he should have been. And the other thing was that he did get involved in some of the production, and in fact appeared in some cameo roles, playing the part of a Marine Corps general. So they worked him into the script and into an episode or two in that role, and he was sort of in the background, but never too far away in the background. And he really liked Robert Conrad, and Cannell spoke about how Conrad was the perfect Greg Boyington in size and in temperament, personality, all of that. I guess we're getting a little off topic to the TV show more than to the Squadron history. Oh, great piece of fine art by Jim Lawyer, who does a lot of really good artwork for magazines and books, and he's just really an exquisite artist. And this is showing some of the Black Sheep and their Corsairs taking off from a place called Munda Point on the island of New Georgia, where the airstrip was right out on this, right out over the water. And it was a place that was quite nasty because it had been bombarded for months and was really devastated. So there were hardly any trees, a lot of shell holes, frankly, a lot of body parts, and just it was pretty ugly.
Did they deployed to a number of different spots as the march toward Japan was going on in the war? Is there one spot or another which is maybe considered their home base?
They had a rear area home base at Turtle Bay Fighter Strip in the New Hebrides on the island of Espiritu Santo. And from there, they would deploy to forward areas wherever that happened to be.
Okay.
For the first iteration of the squadron, that was Guadalcanal, the most famous of the Solomons, down at the southeastern end of the island. And then as the island hopping campaign progressed towards the northwest, they went to new islands as they were captured and airstrips became available. So their next stop was in the Russell Islands, which was kind of idyllic. And then Munda Point on New Georgia was their third stop. And that's where they probably had the worst trouble with illnesses, dysentery, malaria, dengue fever, things like that. Boyington's group did some fighting out of Munda Point. And then in their second tour, they went up to the island of Vella La Vella to a fighter strip called Barracoma. And then finally, they wound up on Bougainville at a place called Torquemada on Empress Augusta Bay. So they did follow the progression of new island territory as Admiral Halsey's campaign progressed. From Bougainville, they could fly all the way to Rabaul, which was the big Japanese stronghold in the Bismarck archipelago. And that was where the Japanese had a huge harbor, lots of airfields, lots of anti-aircraft guns. It was really a tough nut. And they had the Black Sheep had their heaviest losses on missions over Rabaul during the second combat tour. This is kind of near and dear to me. I'm a native of Pennsylvania, and there were more Black Sheep from that state than any other state in the Union, 7 of them. And I got to know all but 2 of them. The guy on right in the center of the first row was Paul Mullen from Pittsburgh, who survived the war only to be killed in a midair collision near Japan in 1946. A real tragedy. And then the guy who is in the middle of the back row passed away. That's Bob Bragdon, passed away from natural causes long before they started having reunions. But all the others I got to meet in person, corresponded even quite extensively with some of them, and they were all really admirable people. I really felt like that enriched my life tremendously to get to know those men.
Yeah. Sean just popped in with a question. He was wondering how long they were in New Georgia.
They would bounce back and forth sometimes, Steve. So the squadron worked out of New Georgia for maybe a couple of weeks at a time.
Okay.
And then would pull back to the Russell Islands, maybe, which is a little bit nicer facility. So they didn't stay necessarily at one strip for an entire combat tour. A typical combat tour lasted 6 weeks. which is a pretty long time to be up there facing the enemy day in and day out. And then after a 6-week tour concluded, the squadron would pull back to the rear area, to the place I mentioned before, Turtle Bay, and they would kind of reconstitute. You know, they would work on the airplanes. The men would have a chance to relax a little bit, kind of, you know, get a little bit better sleep, a little healthier food. They would typically fly down to Australia for a week for some real R&R. The problem with that was that they always came back more tired and run down than when they left from partying too hard. But, you know, they were young and, you know, young and vigorous. And so that was a big deal for them and something they really anticipated. But a 6-week tour was demanding, especially because the Japanese were very good at sending random single bombers over the islands at night, what became known kind of ubiquitously as Washing Machine Charlie, because of the way the engines, their twin engine bombers, the most common bombers were the Betty and the Nell, and they had these unsynchronized engines, and so they did kind of sound like an old-fashioned washing machine. And that was where the nickname Washing Machine Charlie came from, that they would, whatever bomber came overhead on a given night, it was enough to get the searchlights to go on and anti-aircraft guns to start shooting. And, you know, you can't sleep through that. And they would have to roll out of their cot and take cover in a bomb shelter. So it was disruptive. Sanitation was bad. Food was bad. So you've got these guys who are not eating well, not sleeping well, getting in the cockpit maybe 2 or even 3 times a day, in extremely, extremely hot, humid conditions, which would sap your energy even if you were healthy. So, yeah, this is a great opportunity to kind of emphasize how bad the conditions were and how rough it was on their health. Pretty tough.
Yeah. One of our viewers, let's see, where'd it go? There it is. Henry Kyle, thank you for the question. He's going to kick the hornet's nest. In your opinion, statistically, were the Marine Corps aviators better in combat than the naval aviators?
Ooh, boy. Yeah, that's, you know, I'm not exactly qualified. I have to be careful. I'm not trying to dodge the question. That's not it. I'm trying to be a little bit diplomatic about it. I'd almost call it a wash. The Marines flew the Corsairs in the Solomons, which were handed down by the Navy because the Navy struggled with them in the early versions, getting them aboard carriers safely. The Navy brought out the F6F Hellcat, which had the same engine as the Corsair, and it had the same gun package. And I don't even know, Steve, off the top of my head, what the so-called kill ratios even are. And it's hard to really qualify those accurately anyway, because they look at the official records, which were the victories that were claimed and awarded, which were exaggerated by both sides anyway. So you have to remember that. But the Hellcat was a great fighter, and the Corsair was a great fighter. I don't really know, and I'm not trying to dodge it. I don't know which one had the better kill ratio, to be very honest with you. They both were very rugged, and they were both heavy. Now, I can say that Jack Bolt, one of the real innovators with the Black Sheep Squadron, he's not pictured in this photo, but we do have a good picture of him. Bolt once mentioned that he really liked the Corsair as a gun platform because it was a little bit longer. the Hellcat was a little on the short side, and he felt like that made the, as a gunnery platform, just a little bit more twitchy. But I can't relate that other than the way he explained it. But the Corsair had a lot of weight. It was around 14,000 pounds, I think. So it's a pretty heavy airplane.
Right.
And he called it a very good gunnery platform. So knowing what I know about him and his innovative qualities, I'd say that was a pretty good endorsement.
There you go. Going back to the art print that we saw before, one of the viewers is wondering what was the name of the artist again, and especially the spelling of the last name?
Jim Laurier. It's actually got a French spelling. Look up. It looks like, I'd have to almost look and see if I can do that while I'm on here. It's pronounced Laurier, but it's a French spelling. I want to say it's Laurie maybe, or something in that iteration. Okay. Don't misquote me on that. And I can probably find something on here if you don't mind me clicking on my computer while I don't want to mess up what we've got going here. So anyway, Jim Laurier. It might look like Laurier. Okay. But he's explained that they go by the Americanized pronunciation of the name.
Okay. Well, we were
Marvelous
talking.
Artist.
Yes, we were talking before about R&R, a little rest and relaxation there. So like some good sandwiches.
Yep. Okay. And that's Jack Bolt in second from the right, third from the left. The guy I was just talking about. Yep. He was actually an innovator in more ways than one. And the story behind this photograph was that there was a garbage dump at Turtle Bay that was overrun by wild hogs. And so Jack Bolt and another friend of his who liked to hunt and fish, they came up with a way to trap a bunch of wild hogs at this dump. And they basically killed them and barbecued them. And so they had fresh barbecue. They probably got the CBs or something to, make some bread for them. And then they would get a ration of beer. There are some good stories about guys putting a case of beer in the little luggage compartment of an airplane and taking it up to altitude to chill it, and basically almost freeze it, and then coming right back down as fast as they could and popping out while the beer was still cold. This being nighttime, that wouldn't have been something that probably happened, but when you only get a little beer, you don't really care whether it's warm or cold. And so, they're, you can kind of tell from the looks on their faces that they're feeling no pain. Yep. And this is one of the few times that they had an opportunity to, let their hair down, so to speak, and enjoy a little beer and some good food. Jack and his friend Bob Bragdon also dynamited some streams to get these really big white fish out of the streams. And so they would have fish fries in addition to some fresh barbecue from time to time. Another party photo. You'd think maybe there really was something to that whole bit in Hollywood of them being sort of misfits, but this was typical of what would happen back in the rear area. Those are some pretty good sized bottles. So I don't know if those are just, big quart sized beer bottles or what they are, but Boyington's right in the middle wearing the Garrison cap. Yep. And I don't know if it's possible to zoom in on the photo, but he's a little bit pie-eyed, which is pretty easy to see. At the far left on that photograph is the flight surgeon, a guy named Jim Reams, who is a Navy lieutenant. He was a popular character in the squadron because he did dispense brandy after each combat mission. And he told the story of Boyington going into his tent and using a ball peen hammer to break the lock off of his medicinal cabinet to get to the brandy. And that's not a contrived story. That sounds exactly like something that Greg Boyington would have done. He did struggle with alcohol even over there. He drank when he could, and freely admitted, and this is even available in a recorded talk that he gave. He admitted to waking up hungover on the day of a mission and having to stick his head into a rain barrel and just basically try to clear the cobwebs for several minutes before he felt like he could walk out to the airplane and lead a combat mission. So he had some character flaws, as we all do, I think. His were just kind of more out there for everybody to see.
And I take it this photo and the one before that, these are not from the official Marine Corps press unit.
No, that's right. One of the big benefits of being able to join the squadron for that 50th anniversary gathering in 1993 was being granted access to all of their personal photo albums.
Wow.
There was a lot of redundancy there because they all shared photos, and they had a great intel officer, a guy named Frank Walton, who was a former LA Sheriff's County cop before the war. LA County Sheriff's Department, excuse me, get the nomenclature right. But he was a cop before the war and was really well organized. And he was also really savvy with the media. And he got all kinds of great photos that he gathered together, and then he would get prints out to all the pilots. So some of the guys had their own personal cameras, and that's where these types of photographs came from. Pretty famous photo. In fact, I've just been working on this one for the current episode that I have in production for this series. This was a plane that was marked up at Turtle Bay in late November of 1943, right before Boyington led his squadron out on their second combat tour. And it's doctored up with these stick-on victory flags. There are 20 of them there, each one representing the 20 victories that he was officially credited with at that time. And then in chalk, there's the name of his girlfriend on the cowling. And it happens to be Lucy Bell, after a woman named Lucy Malcolmson, who he had met when he was coming back from China by ship. There it is. So the name Lucy Bell was written in white chalk on the airplane. But years after the war, Greg Boyington and Lucy Malcolmson had a very public falling out. He basically dumped her at the altar for another woman, and she took him to court to keep an allotment that he had set aside that she was using to help take care of his kids while he was overseas. And he tried to get that money back and lost $15,000, which was a lot of money back in those days. And he could never forgive her for that. And so to deflect it all, he maintained that the name on the Corsair was Lulu Bell. And that name was printed on all kinds of artwork over the decades. And it's all a big piece of misinformation. They call it fake news now, I guess. Yep. But yeah, it was a deliberate piece of misinformation. I think it's quite humorous. And it's all over, a busted relationship and jealousy that he changed the name from Lucy Bell to Lulu Bell, as far as the public knew. Yep. And it wasn't until this photograph came out, and that's a guy named Bob McClurg. After that publicity shot, Bob McClurg and one of the other pilots, they jumped up in the cockpit to get their own hero shots. And so these photos didn't come to the light of day until into the late 90s, or maybe even, after 2000, that they came out of their private collections to reveal that the name really was Lucy Bell all along.
Well, and if you want to have fun on any World War II history site and watch the comments go back and forth, just claim that it's one name or the other on that Corsair.
Yeah.
And the debate will rage on.
And this plane has been portrayed as being flown on combat missions, yep. Which it was not. It was all part of a publicity shoot. The PR machine was working well back in those days.
There you go.
Great casual shot of the second tour guys on Vela La Vela. Talk about, I was referring to not getting much sleep. So the guy in the boxer shorts is, and you see how skinny they are.
Yeah.
The guy behind him is almost emaciated looking. And that was actually the oldest guy in the squadron. Fred Avey was actually older than Avery. He was actually a few months older than Greg Boyington was. But the guy in the boxers is Ned Corman, who grew up in the same county where I grew up. And we were probably, I had probably the most fascinating and close relationship with Ned in his later years, just because of our hometown location. Great guy. They were all great guys. I got to know, again, quite a few of those that are pictured there, and I'm so much the better for it.
Those the oral histories that you had recorded, are those available anywhere, or are they in the archives at Pensacola?
They are, as far as I know, in the archives at Pensacola. They were the main research for my books. Mm-hmm. And I relied extremely heavily on them. I ended up interviewing about 40 or so pilots from VMF 214. And you know what? You bring up a question that's never been asked, whether these are out there in the public domain. I know I've got transcripts, but whether they're out there in another repository, I don't really know. I'd have to check with some of my contacts.
Yeah, that's usually a question that people will ask is, are they out there somewhere? And there are some oral histories that are available online, but so many of them have just been recorded and sort of stowed away for whatever the future will bring. And now with the digital age, it's easier to make those available, but it's still a lot of work to digitize and organize.
Right, and in those days, I was recording with a little micro cassette recorder, and they don't do very well as far as longevity.
No.
So the tapes that I do have are not in good shape anymore. Yeah. But luckily, I do have the transcripts.
That's good.
This is not an uncommon sight. I believe this was at Torquay on Bougainville. What often happened with this narrow runway, which was we're looking across the runway, not down the length of it.
Okay.
And it was lined with pierced steel planking called Marston mat, which made a pretty good surface, although it got slick when it was wet. And of course, it rained basically every day, quite hard. And so that planking was oftentimes wet or even had puddles. And to the sides of the strip was loose coral. It was built on a former swamp. So they had to bring in, I don't know how many cubic yards of crushed coral just to build up the foundation for the runway. And if a pilot let one main gear drift off the planking into that soft coral, it almost invariably led to a turn turtle, an upside down flip. If the pilot had the time and the reaction and could duck down, he might spare himself. But a lot of them got hurt or really messed up or even killed if the plane went upside down. You can see this photograph has the entire vertical stabilizer crushed down, and even the spine behind the cockpit is crumpled some. The pilot who was flying this was a guy with the interesting name of Denmark Groover, who might sound Scandinavian or something, but he actually came from Macon, Georgia, a real Southern gentleman. And you would think having the number 777 would be lucky. You know, it's a great jackpot, but in this case, it was not. He flipped it at Torquemada and got a little banged up in the process.
Well, one of the things that in your travels with this group and being associated with the Black Sheep, you've also had a long history with the Commemorative Air Force's Dixie Wing, now known as Air Base Georgia. And we'd be remiss if we didn't kind of talk a little bit about how you got involved with the CAF.
Well, there's some great continuity there in that the CAF has a Corsair. It's an FG1. Mm-hmm. People who are familiar with that one, it's you got the side number 530 and the checkerboard empennage. That's a former Dixie Wing, now Air Base Georgia aircraft, and that's its home base. And yeah, there was an event that we had in 2003 with 4 of the Black Sheep, and then I served as the moderator on a really fun symposium where I didn't do all the talking. These guys all did the talking. I think one of them was not able to make it, and looks like I know Jim Hill, Tom Emmerich, Boo was there, Bourgeois, Ed Harper. So I'm thinking it was probably Harry Johnson, the 5th guy listed there, who was not able to make it to the program. But we had 4 guys there. All 4 of them, no, correction, 3 of the 4 were with both of the tours led by Boyington. Henry Bourgeois was with the first tour, and then he finished his personal obligation and went home. Harry Johnson, who didn't make it to that event, was one of the replacements who came in just for the second tour. And Harry's distinction is that he was one of the last Black Sheep. He was the last one that I'm aware of to pass away. They're all gone now. And I think Harry was the last. And he was also the last pilot in 214 to shoot down an enemy plane. And that goes all the way through the modern era. It became an attack squadron, and then basically a composite fighter attack squadron. And now I think they're flying the F-35.
Oh.
Yeah, Harry was the last guy to shoot down a plane in any of the 214 squadron iterations.
Has 214 been active all the way from World War II to today, or did it stand down for a while and get stood up again?
I'm pretty sure it stood down for a short period of time after World War II and then was reorganized for Korea. I could be wrong about that. Okay. But they were one of the first squadrons into Korea. They craned a bunch of F4U -4s, the 4-bladed Corsairs, aboard a small carrier, and were launched pretty soon after the war started. And they did a lot of close air support for the troops over during the Korean War. In fact, they lost quite a lot of pilots to enemy ground fire. They were pretty vulnerable to that. They were still active as an attack squadron, flying A4 Skyhawks in Vietnam, and then later they transitioned into the Harrier, the jump jet, and then later still, more recently, into the F-35. So there have probably been a few periods now and then, but not very long, where the squadron was inactive. But like I said, just a few periods of short inactivity.
Were they ever equipped with the bubble canopy, or was it always the bird cage?
Oh, no, they were.
They were, okay.
The bird cage was around for the majority of the first tour. They had under Boyington, they still had bird cage versions, but the Dash 1 A came in during that first tour, and then during the second tour, they had more of the 1A, which had the bubble canopy, but with a little reinforcement in the bubble. And then the squadron was broken up after Boyington was shot down and became a POW. And they reformed at Santa Barbara in California in 1944. And they flew the F4U-1D and went aboard the USS Franklin. Okay. And that's where the squadron really got beat up when the Franklin was bombed. And they lost a lot of personnel in that.
So in just a couple of minutes that we have left, what are your final thoughts as you look back on the time that you've been able to spend with the squadron, with the squadron members? As you mentioned, they're gone now, but you must have some very, very fond memories of spending time with them.
I certainly do. They were humble. There were a few who like to call out some of what they had done, but oftentimes when they did that, their own squadron members would, kind of do the cough and call them out for what they were doing, and they policed each other in that way. So I found them to be modest and humble and successful people. After the war, they accomplished an awful lot. During the two tours with Boyington, they were officially credited with shooting down 97 aircraft. And again, there's some argument to be made about the difference between the official victories and what they really were able to do. Probably a lot of not duplicity, but a lot of cases, and they would admit this themselves, that there might be three guys all shooting at the same plane, and each of them would see it from his own perspective and get credit for it because they didn't have gun cameras. So everything was done on the honor system. Gun cameras were out in the fleet, but they weren't installed in those Corsairs, and they didn't have the means to develop the film anyway. So it was all on the honor system. So they accomplished a tremendous amount of what they did to support the island hopping campaign cannot be overstated. Let's put it that way.
Well, good. Bruce, you mentioned the podcast that you have on YouTube. It is Sky Warrior Media. Go look it up. Give him a like and a follow.
Thank you.
Yeah, when does the next episode come out? When are you planning that?
I don't try to stick to a deadline, but it's coming together fairly quickly. So this still being early July, I have high hopes for it being out before the end of the month. Okay. I'm a one-man show. I do all the editing. I write the narration. You're probably very familiar with how much time it takes to edit clips. Yep. In video clips and blend in audio and everything else. So it's really labor intensive. And I'm trying to crank them out as fast as I can while sticking to good standards of quality.
Good. Well, and Sky Warrior Media, you go there. If you hit the subscribe and hit the bell icon, when that new episode is posted, then you'll get a notice about that, just like you do for Warbird 2.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So,
I am happy to say the channel's growing fast, and I really appreciate all the support that I'm getting for it.
Awesome. And if folks are looking for your books, where can they find those?
My best recommendation is to go online. Okay. Either through Amazon or Goodreads or some of the other places where you can find, just type in my name, and they'll find the books pretty quickly. Some of them are getting a little hard to find now. Others are still out there in pretty wide circulation. It's hard to believe that that first book came out more than 25 years ago. So making me feel old.
Time flies when you're having fun.
That's right.
That is very, very true. Well, Bruce, thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for everyone in the audience for sticking with us tonight. We'd like to hear your thoughts on tonight's episode, or if you have ideas for future topics, just drop us a line at media@cafhq.org. Again, if you like tonight's show, share it across your social media platforms. And as we said before, remember to click that subscribe bell icon, and you will get notifications when our new episodes are posted. Until next time, I wish you blue skies and tailwinds for the Commemorative Air Force. I'm Steve Buss. Have a good night.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Appreciate it.